Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you all for coming out on this rather not so sunny Sunday. This is, as Stephen mentioned, the third of the lectures that I'll be giving. There are three more, so we're about halfway through. And I've been developing a number of different themes. So far, we have looked, for instance, at the matter of graphs, that is both writing, but also images or pictures that might be imbued or thought to be imbued with vitality. And there's a bit of a paradox here in that they are inert images seemingly, but nonetheless might be thought by the ancient Maya, and as we understand them today, to be bubbling with vitality. The second lecture, the one last week, had to do with the matter of makers and making. And here too, I was examining this matter of a paradox in that these would be highly skilled practitioners or technicians capable of creating some of the works we'll be looking at this afternoon. But at the same time, they are also figures who were potentially understandable as miracle workers insofar as they were capable of injecting or projecting vitality into the pieces that they left behind for us to study. Now, today, we're going to be looking at another set of playful understandings and playful work that was done anciently on Maya imagery and text of approximately 12 to 1300 years ago. This is the classic period that has been the subject of most of my research over the last 40 years. It's a little staggering to say that. And these topics have to do today with size and scale, and ultimately how these are understood in variable ways and by means that we're going to be gradually disentangling this afternoon. Let's start with an extreme. You are looking here at a photograph taken in 1883 by Alfred Percival Maudsley, who had made his way into an area that is now populated by a lot of banana groves, and he photographed these astounding carvings. This is a stela that comes from the city of Quirigua. We don't know what its ancient name was, but Quirigua was applied later. Why is this an extreme in terms of studies of scale and size? Well, you'll quickly notice a number of things, which I'll talk about in a second or so, but that there's a small human being leaning to the side or just to the side of this monument, clearly put there by the photographer for reasons of human scale. Now, we have a name for this monument. It is called the Ante na Chanyo Pat. It was probably so named because it was a singular kind of object, and we suspect that most named pieces and carvings and even smaller things that were celebrated by the Maya were widely known. They were widely regarded and probably discussed, not just at Quirigua, but at many other locations. Now, on this stela is a depiction of the then current king, the individual who commissioned this monument. And his name was Kakdiliu Chanyo Pat, which is somewhat similar to the name of the carving itself. I don't think that's a coincidence. But his name meant something like an aspect of the rain god who kindles fire in the sky. Now let's return to our human being positioned here for reasons of scale by the photographer many, many years ago. I would estimate, and this is marked by a question, as you can see here, at about 1.4 meters in height. And that's simply because we know the size of this monument in absolute terms, and he is probably an adult. Now, what we can also say is that his body, the body of this human scale, is vastly disproportionate to the carving that you see behind you on that stela. The stela shows a king who is, in this instance, 2.14 times as large as the humans. Now, these kinds of carvings have an obvious impact emotionally on the viewer in that they're dominant and they're dominating. I would also venture to add, though, that in some respects, this is a non-interactive piece. It's in what I call that fourth wall kind of three-dimensional positioning in which you could presumably walk up to the king and he would presumably look out at you from this vitalized monument. But in point of fact, his eyes are so high off the ground that it would be more of an imperious kind of glance. He wouldn't necessarily be looking at people nearby and just perhaps only those who were positioned at a distance. Now, I would also distinguish here between two different concepts. One is that of largeness, or something that is larger. That's physically larger. But then there's also the matter, and this is getting to the core, the essence of my presentation this afternoon. This is a greater being. He is someone who is socially salient, socially distinguished, and made markedly distinct from anybody nearby. There's also two other aspects here that I need to dwell on. One of which is, this is not the only such carving at Quiriguá. There are also some that are, dare I say, runtish, much smaller. And it's been widely conjectured by scholars, and I think this is true, that the reason this is such a small carving over to the right-hand side of this image is because it was probably part of a much larger blank that might even have been left in the quarry. And then somehow it snapped. Someone made a terrible accident. We can only imagine the consequences for this. And as a result, they decided not to throw this in the garbage or the bin, so to speak, but rather to re-employ it. Then there's another aspect of this stela that needs to be mentioned, which is that they're not just comparisons between carvings within Quiriguá, but there would be, at least in the mental image of those looking at this monument, a comparison with the stelae found at a competitive center, a dynastic capital known as Copan, much older, far more distinguished, far more powerful. And yet by some happenstance, we don't fully understand. The king of Copan, who is in fact depicted here in Copan Stela B, was taken captive by Quiriguá. And I think it could be no coincidence that soon thereafter, these monuments at Quiriguá are ever so much larger, and we can say greater, than those at the site that they are probably mimicking. Initially, probably Quiriguá was under the thumb of Copan, and there has been, so to speak, a visual and a graphic declaration of independence. The scales have to be understood between sites as well as within them. Now let's get small. Let's speak about different aspects of scale with this object, which is relatively easy to understand for those who are conversant with Maya writing. It's referring in its text to the raising up of a headdress, which would be placed on the brow of the king, or a royal figure, we shall say, who is ensconced on a throne over to the side. It just so happens that this is a mythic scene, and that the figure on the throne is probably in form of the early Maya maize god. There is also a date that tells you precisely when this happened, again, probably in unimaginably remote time. It seems to be at the beginning of the dry season, perhaps related to calendrical and agricultural cycles. Now let's compare that object. Again, it's in mythic time, but remarkably similar to what some of the most renowned carvings made by the Maya. This comes from the city of Piedras Negras. It has very similar themes. There's a cosmic bird up in the poised in the sky. There's a figure who is enthroned, and the throne itself consists also of another evocation of the sky, as well as a crocodile of all things. That stela, however, from Piedras Negras is 2.9 meters high. And when we look at the little bone pin, which is now in the Dallas Museum of Arts, it is about this high. It is about 7.62. And so we have what seems to be an almost curious and, dare I say it, meaningful transposition of size, in which admittedly these are in different times, but nonetheless they are being shown at radically different size and scale with respect to the human hand. This is something we see commonly with sacred objects, and this is a matter that's been pointed out in print by James Porter, who was then a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, in which there is a kind of transposition, especially with sacred objects, in which the same hieroglyph might refer to a polished stone adze imbued with life, as you see on the left-hand side of this image, and it might also be an object that could be shown as the picture or the image of a sacred king living, in this instance, about 1,300 to 1,400 years ago. So there's an element of the miraculous here. There are meaningful local elements that we will seek to disentangle in the course of this lecture. So this afternoon, we're going to start by looking at size and scale, specifically with comparative or Maya evidence. Now, there's a immense literature about this matter of scale and size in the history of art, and indeed in ancillary disciplines like philosophy. If we go back to the 18th century, there is the aesthetician and the founder of the conservative movement, Edmund Burke, who wrote at length about what he called the sublime. I'm not here to talk about romantic literature and its inception in this period and all sorts of concepts of that sort, but Edmund Burke did introduce an emotional dimension to how size would be appreciated by those, and he's speaking here specifically of the 18th century, but he claims to be making universal observations. For him, the small is something that would evoke pleasure, even affection, and the large would possibly instill in the viewer a feeling of fear, of distaste, and even of awe, leading in itself to a kind of special pleasure in his opinion. Now, the more recent analyst of scale and size takes us into pre-Columbian America, and this is among the Inca. And there's an exceptional and indispensable book, instructive, I think, to everyone who reads it, by Andrew Hamilton, which looks at Inca scale. And there, Hamilton was looking more in terms of formal comparisons, that is, between the absolute finite measurable dimensions of an object and then the kind of relations that exist between them. And we've already touched in part on the relations while examining that carving from the city of Copan. Hamilton's typology here of scale behavior, you might say, has to do with, first, reduction, that is, a reduced form with respect to its original. So the little bone pin we were looking at has a very small figure on it, a figure that would presumably be relatable to the human physique, the human size. Then their objects become much, much larger. And then he also refers to this idea of the commensurate, that is, of an object that is very close in size to its original. And we will be examining all three of these. There's one aspect that Hamilton did not necessarily touch on, mostly, I think, because of the particularities of the Inca evidence, which is the matter of social distinction, of inequality and hierarchy. And this is something that absolutely saturates the Maya evidence, as we'll see today. A third individual to discuss here, in addition to, of course, Burke, but also Hamilton, and is Emanuele Lugli, who's recently written a book about scale. And his point is that there are gropings through time that are often inexact, that are localized, moving towards the metrical reality that we now exist in, a foot that is just so, a meter that is just so, in absolute and finite dimensions. And here he has pointed out that in much of medieval and even early modern Italy, there were many local struggles for determining, often with changes of regime, what exactly measurement, size, and indeed ultimately our determinations of scale might involve. Let's look at the small in particular. And here I draw upon the work of John Mack. The small is something that could be explored in all sorts of fun ways. This is, of course, one of the Lewis chessmen. And these can be seen in the British Museum today. They're made out of, I believe, walnut ivory. It is tiny, and clearly that is not the size of a human being, because you would hold it in your hand. But a human being who will soon appear on that very a throne much like that, now we've got a countdown, folks, is King Charles III. Now, the king in the chess piece is a king and a chess piece, and anyone looking at that would understand that ultimately it's referring relationally to the human form. But there's also a smaller dimension here to explore what Mack has touched on, and that is the tactility of the chess piece. You would hold it in your hand, you would feel the smoothness and occasional corrugations of the walrus ivory, And that tactility is something that extends to many small things. And here I'm, again, exploring the emotional textures and landscape that Edmund Burke drew our attention to some, in this case, about 250 years ago. We have toys, we have juvenilia, we have objects such as this, which comes from late antiquity in the conditions of exceptional preservation in Egypt. And these are often linked to the objects tied to children. And I think, as all of us nervous parents know, you don't want a small child carrying an even smaller child around because they have a tendency to drop them. And so this is a way of inculcating behaviors and practices in ways that might be gendered. These are small things for young bodies and young hands. Another emotion that is occasionally summoned or elicited by these objects is, I think, exemplified by this piece, not Maya, but it is the renowned Phoenix jewel that's also in the British Museum. And if you look very carefully at it, I think anyone can appreciate this object out of gold and with enamels, possibly influenced and even directed by the work of by Nicholas Hilliard himself. And there is palpably here a sense of the virtuosic skill that went into the creation of this object. The emotions don't stop there. There are also small vignetted objects, the eye of Princess Caroline, which was given to her father. She died young and was not able to succeed to the British throne, hence Victoria in the Victorian age. We don't have the Charlottean age as a result. But all you see here is, on the reverse, you can't see it, but it's a lock of her hair. But what is visible is her single eye. That eye would only be presumably identifiable in the close and intimate appreciation of, in that case, the Prince Regent. The meanings and emotions, though, are always local. And here I would beg to differ with Burke by claiming that there are universalizing aspects to this, because there are sometimes meanings that are attendant in size and scale that have a lot to do with what is felt locally. This has been studied by Catherine Allen, who taught here for many years, not too far from this museum. And she has looked at miniatures and small objects being made in South America and has noticed there could be love, there could be awe, reverence, gratitude, but also mixed therein an almost psychological aspect of anxiety and fear. The small and has within it the potential always to be a microcosm of something that is larger. And an earlier Mellon lecturer here, Wu Hung from the University of Chicago, has looked closely at these sorts of small spirit topographies or landscapes. In this case, it's the Hunping jar. It would have gone into a Chinese tomb. It contains and becomes the housing for the soul of the person who would be interred nearby. The fact that it's small, the fact that it is includable here, but the fact that it also appears to depict a considerable urban landscape with many people is part of its unique potency. Having gone through this comparative evidence, let's turn to the Maya. And there will be some more sideway nods to places around the world, acknowledging that most of you are probably not that familiar with the Maya. Now, the Maya evidence that I'm looking at is mostly from the first millennium AD, but we'll be touching on a few objects that come before. Let's first, however, turn to the very recent Maya, the Maya who are very much with us. There are many living now, speakers of Mayan languages, not too far, or in fact, in Washington, D.C. itself. And their languages, of which there are quite a few dozen, often radically different, nonetheless congeal into a number of different descriptives for what is big. They can refer to something as being large, fat, expanding, robust, brave, old, like this Mellon lecturer, and also right or right-handed, which is exceptionally good, as the Maya would understand this today and in the past. Now, when they refer to things that are small, there's a contrastive vocabulary. And again, we're speaking about modern Mayan languages, in which there might be a negation of something that's big. No is big. Ma no means not big. There could also be an intensification that takes place through reduplication of certain words. So if you want to refer to something that's really, really small, you might say in one of the Mayan languages, itik, or chuchu, or tutu, or chan. And then there are a series of biometaphors, if I get this thing to work, which we'll talk about in the second or so, little cute things that can be likened to other cute and little things. But then there is also, both in formal and informal rhetoric, the use of these diminutives, these reductions of things to small size in ways that can be seen as wheedling, convincing, and ultimately as an aspect of sacred speech. And so it takes us into the direction that Catherine Allen was referring to before. What can we say of measurements? Well, why not muster the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo? That's our quintessential human body. We're not going to speak about Leonardo here this afternoon, but I will use him to illustrate some of the ways in which the Maya, in languages that are still spoken, refer to measurements. For instance, if your hands are held out this far in Chorti, which is an important language in terms of the Maya decipherment, we can say it's bisar. It is a term that is distinctly applicable to that. But more to the point, that length is then transferable to chords or even to sticks in ways that Emanuele Lugli might have recognized in his own explorations of early modern and medieval measurements in Italy. There are other aspects of the human body. There's the hand, but that might also be extendable to the entire forearm. And so there are ways in which you have to look carefully at local usage as to what is being referred to. Now, as we dip into the Maya evidence, again, from the time that interests me most in these lectures, there are all sorts of measurements which are now accessible to us through recent decipherments. For instance, when the hand is held just that way, that's my hand photographed on the Acela a few days ago. People must have thought I was very eccentric passenger, as aren't they all? But you can see here that the thumb and the finger are extendable in ways that could then be used as a very convenient bodily measurement. This is also very tactile in that to measure is to touch something. And I believe that human contact is ultimately quite important here. Now, to decode some of this graphing, that little circle that you see there, right near the wrist, is a way in which the classic Maya, with whom I'm most familiar, would indicate that it is a partable object. That is, it's part of a much larger whole. And anthropologists would describe this as being inalienably possessed. That is a 10-cent word for you. That is, it's an object that simply has to belong to a body. The idea of a hand off by itself is truly horrific, as it would be to us today. The other thing we can say here is I do not believe that the Maya had a firmly fixed idea of measurements. And in fact, what there are very slight variances that come simply from the application in this or that place of someone's hand. So what they all share is the human body. That is ultimately the relational point of reference. One of the other things we can say about Maya practices, and here I am taking you into the beginnings of their civilization and about the beginning of the Common Era, is a peculiarity of their text. Now, one of the largest Maya cities is called El Mirador. It's much in the news all the time for a variety of reasons, good and bad. But this is one of the very few stelae we know from the site, and they're tiny. They're not particularly prepossessing for such a behemoth of a city. You can see it's only about 1 meter high, but it's the glyphs that are most astounding for any specialist looking at the writing. They're only about 3 centimeters high, max. In other words, this is hardly a propagandistic projection of royal will or of royal messaging. You have to get up really close to be able to read this. It probably had a very restricted kind of reception. Another point we can make about the earliest Maya writing is this miniature quality to it. And this is most evident where it occurs, which are small objects such as this piece, which is about easily held in my hand, that's at the Peabody Museum at Yale University, or in this small text that was painted probably about 300 years before the beginning of the Common Era on a wall that was subsequently destroyed, or this object that's in the British Museum that is a jade simulacrum of a shell. But on each of these are tiny, tiny glyphs. And what it suggests is that these objects, which were surely sacred fetishes of some sort, they were ritual paraphernalia, are always meant to be held, they're meant to be viewed up close, and they're meant to be read in that way as well. To get back to Hamilton's typology, you'll recall that he, among his 3 possible scale relations, looked at that scale relation which goes from the large to the small. We see this with sacred objects among the Maya, that kind of transposition and that playing with scale. This is a view of a model of a Maya house, but it's made out of stone. It's relatively small. It's only about 1 meter or so high. And it informs us in no uncertain terms with the glyphic text to its side that is the dwelling place of a small god. Then there are, and these are relatively rare in Maya ruins, we have small miniature vases. And these are not useful for holding anything that can be beyond maybe some pigment or possibly in some cases a bit of tobacco snuff. But this was clearly of interest to the ancient Maya. And then finally, as an example of something that's large and reduced, there's this recent set of images, which just came to me 2 days ago from my former undergraduate at Brown University, Whit Schroeder. And it's an exposed slab of rock near a river in the extreme southeastern part of the state of Chiapas in Mexico. And on it, as imaged here by Whit Schroeder, are Maya cities, including this one laid out in a distinctive kind of splayed manner of pyramids. You can just make out perhaps the small stairways and the small doorways. And nearby are equally small, diminutive stelae, which show rulers on them, and then with small glyphs. The reasons for all of these are a little bit opaque, but it does intrigue me, as I pointed out to Whit just a few days ago, that throughout this are not images of humans. Throughout these carvings on that exposed bedrock are animals, such as the spider monkey, birds, various kinds of unidentified animals or mammals as well. And the thought crosses my mind that we're looking here at the depiction of a Maya city that is now beyond the stage of collapse, and it is simply rife, not with human occupants, but with animals. I mentioned biometaphors in which very cute small things apply to smaller objects as well. So too do the Maya engage in these kind of playful wit. This is a very small conch shell, and I think you can appreciate that from the human hand that is clutching it. And the text is fairly transparent to me, which means it is the hummingbird conch. And you may ask yourself, what in the world are they getting at here? And I think all of us who have been lucky enough to watch the cavorting and somewhat belligerent manner of little hummingbirds know that they are tiny. And the Maya here are doubtless applying a biometaphor and to describe a small object. It's a form of analogy. It's a form of metaphor. There also are objects that would have been very common at Maya courts, at least in their epicenters. This is a sedan chair to the left-hand side of this image. You just make out a little human body depicted on it within this scene that comes from a late classic Maya pot. There are two sticks that stand out to the side. That's for carrying it. These are reproduced in some of those small vessels, the miniature vessels that I showed you in an earlier lecture. And so what is going on here? I believe that the Maya themselves refer to these by means of a biometaphor, because on most of these small objects, arguably they're used, by the way, for tobacco snuff and would have been traded as such, but they are frequently labeled as talk, the small, the youth, and I believe the biometaphor applies. This is their way of conceptualizing and expressing the idea of the small. Now, we've already looked at things that go from the small to the very large, and what better example would there be than that stela from Quiriguá? But when glyphs, the hieroglyphs that I have studied for these last few decades, appear in very large form, as on Yasha Stela 31, these are gigantic signs in comparison to the small bones or those engraved signs on the hummingbird conch we just looked at. Probably the reason for this is nothing more and nothing less than the attitude that someone might have putting up a billboard. You want to make it visible over long distances. And these stelae, as it turns out, as at Yasha, are near long processional paths. And I believe it's to make them legible over considerable distances. The final glyphs that I want to talk about that are very large come from, of all places, the almost invisible locations, or ones that would only be seen by spirits that live within. These are two tombs from the city of Rio Azul in Guatemala, photographed long ago. They are in an advanced state of deterioration now because of bats and guano and the like, regrettably. But their size is considerable. And I believe the reason for this is because these correlate with or correspond to features of the landscape. That is, in this instance, mythic mountains that would literally ring the body of the king when it was placed within that tomb, a body that was regrettably long looted, and many of these objects have since turned up in private and public collections. But there is, I believe here, a gesture or a nod to the geological reality of these mountains, that they would be large, and so too would be their depiction in glyphs. The only place in which this kind of play of size and scale seems to be vigorously demoted in importance has to do with the appearance of objects in the writing itself. And this has also been noted in early Egyptian writing by my friend Andreas Stauder and by Pascal Vernus, who was also at the École in Paris. And here we have a deactivation of size and scale. Now, to explain what I mean by this, what I'm going to do is to look at those two objects just above, which appear in the hieroglyphic staircase at Copan. They show respectively a pyramid and an altar. Probably what the Maya mean to communicate with this is the sum total of civic responsibilities. What makes a city is the place where the deceased and gods are venerated in pyramids, and it is a place in which sacrificial offerings are being made. They're taking us well beyond the daily course of life. Now, there you can see how an actual altar might be depicted with a sacrifice, as I showed you in an earlier slide from an earlier lecture. And that is the great pyramid from which that text actually comes. But notice that although they are vastly disproportionate in size, in truth, in reality, when you see them in the glyphs, they're recalibrated in such a way as to enhance the individual clarity of those signs. That was the first part of my talk. I've got two more. The second part has to do with what I would call the use of somatic or body scale and what it might mean. And here too, we can draw on far-flung parallels, on analogies that are usefully illustrative. And we'll go, in fact, to a fragment of a tomb that is now lost. It is of the grain accountant Nebamun, and it was hacked out in 1820 by a Greek looter, and then eventually sold to a collector and diplomat at the time, Henry Salt, from which it eventually entered into the British Museum. Seem to have a lot of pieces from there today. What does that tell you? And this object is thought by many Egyptologists, insofar as these evaluations are important, as one of the great glories of Egyptian painting. That's not what interests me here. What interests me is how the bodies are shown. And this takes us back to the work of Heinrich Schäfer, another great Egyptologist, who has understood human scale as it would have been canonized, placed in canonical proportions in about the Third Dynasty there in Egypt, in such a way as to reflect respective importance or social salience between people. Now let's look at this fragment from this now lost tomb. Well, we have Nebamun, who is the primary figure, and then there is his wife, Hatshepsut, not the pharaoh that you probably heard about. And down below is their daughter, and they're off clubbing and throwing sticks at hapless birds over to the side. But by this means, they're showing within at least the context of a household here in about 1350 BC, the fact that these individuals are of different status. Now, that could also be transposed into how pharaohs might be shown in association with their underlings. They're always big, they're always larger, and they're always greater. These graded levels occur in Maya carvings. This is an example that comes from the city of Coba in northern Yucatan. And what it displays for us is a king. It's in all of the customary tableau that we associate with these kinds of public carvings. He's holding what used to be called a ceremonial scepter. We actually have no real idea what these things represent. They're one of the mysteries of Maya art. And then around it is the kind of nearly suffocating text that I described in my last lecture, in which they begin to impinge on the space that the Maya, usually in these kinds of carvings and in their other images, wish to fill. He's the primary figure. So think of it in some ways as being the analogy to Nebamun from a very different time and place. There are secondary figures to the side, and these figures are notably smaller than the king himself. They're kneeling, to be sure, but nonetheless, they are demoted in the visual sphere to accord with their demotion in a social one as well. They happen to be captives. We know this because their arms are bound behind their backs. And then in the tertiary level, we don't have the offspring, the child, the daughter of Nebamun. But we have yet other captives who are in a highly uncomfortable position of being ground underfoot by the king. This is not, you might say, a subtle art, but is one that is deploying all of the techniques and instruments of scale and size in order to let you know who is important, who's uppermost, and who is not, who is on the ins and who is on the outs. There is sometimes what I would also call, and this is another mouthful along with inalienability, this has to do with what I would describe as intra-image within an image of a kind of relational fidelity, in which within the scene that's been set aside here on this particular carving, it is also from the city of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, where I spent many, many years digging. We have the image of a king, and he's standing over the side. He is in full frontal position, and that is one way of denoting his very high status, as we touched on in the last class. This was a lecture series. I'm still back at Brown, apparently, notionally, cognitively, but I think of all of you as my rapt students. In any case, over to the side is a small figure, and we know a lot about this individual because he's named. And this is one example in which we're not simply dependent on a visual understanding, but we can use the hieroglyphs to extract suitable meaning. And he is called the Chokyokibahao, meaning he is the young lord of the kingdom. Now, he's not said to be a sacred lord, which is an office usually allotted to the king himself, but he is almost certainly the heir to the throne. And then he, because of his name, only appears here and here only. He disappears from the epigraphic or the textual record. It could be he never came to the throne, or perhaps he was a monarch that lived and reigned so briefly that no subsequent mention is made of him. But look at the dimensions here. Look at the image of in terms of the relational scale that I just alluded to before. The king is that height, and notice that this youth over to the side is appreciably smaller, as though you were standing in front of living flesh and blood actors, and you're able to understand them in that respect. Now, there's one aspect of scale that I'm going to embroider a little bit right now and elaborate on somewhat, but it too will take us to a very different location, a very different kind of context, not New Kingdom Egypt, but in this case into the book world of the later Middle Ages. And this is a document that I happened to see some years ago. It is in the Cloisters collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it was on display down at the Morgan for some reason or another. It was commissioned by someone who is, believe it or not, a very distant ancestor of mine, Bonne de Luxembourg, who had commissioned this work in order that she might attend to on a daily basis to the devotions that would ultimately lead her to heaven, that would make her a better person, a better Christian, and ultimately a better spouse to her husband. What is on it is this strangely, and I hate to use this analogy, but almost kind of a vaginal object which floats and looks out at you in a almost sinister way. That is the wound of Christ. And what we're looking at is what Andrew Hamilton would have called a kind of commensuration, a one-to-one-ism in which the various instruments of torture that unfortunately were visited upon the body of Christ, which you can see around this object, they include the spear, they include the cross, they include the scourge. They're much, much smaller, but they're looming in front of you in a manner that dominates the surface of this carefully vented, prepared surface is in fact the wound of Christ, what was thought to be the actual size of that wound. And it could presumably have been touched by this very high-ranking member of late Middle Age medieval society. The fact that this is possibly produced by a female illustrator named Bourgault de Noir, it suggests maybe there are some analogies going on here. And then it would have been also, of course, purchased for and perhaps commissioned by a woman. And again, the size of this tells you that it could be the very wound that doubting Thomas was able to touch there after Christ had gone through his crucifixion. I bring up this matter of commensuration because I believe that at some sites, only a few, there's a dynastic preoccupation with rigorous commensuration what might almost be described as a one-to-one-ism, by which it is exceptionally important to create an image, a carving of a captive or of a king that would be very similar to that of a human being. An example of this, and there are many, are mostly focused at the site of Tonina in Chiapas, Mexico, which has here a figure, headless. Most of these are mutilated in some way, probably at the time of the Maya collapse. And there you can make out that it is a figure who is standing. His arms are carefully folded in front of him. He is about 89 centimeters high, literally. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think back to that person we saw as a human scale at Quiriguá and to see this is getting awfully close to what might be the variance of an actual height of a human body. And it is not just here in this carving, but several others, including even the image of a dog placed near someone's tomb that correspond in an almost exact one-to-one way with what you would expect a dog to be in terms of its size, or here a human. Now, there is also a curious aspect of this carving in which there is a small indentation or depression just over the chest. And it's as if possibly, conceivably, objects were taken in and out, including precious objects of jade that might have been inserted, removed, and perhaps replaced at some other time. Now, this may seem an uninteresting kind of observation that one-to-one-ism and rigorous commensuration is important around the world. I remember giving some of these ideas in a presentation some years ago, and it was thought to be exceedingly banal and uninteresting, but really it isn't, for the reason that a Maya, as I explained in the last lecture, refer to an image or a portrait as a body. And we know this because of hieroglyphs that David Stewart and I have studied over the years. There is a claim to existence in a depiction in which it is said to share in the body and potentially in the identity of the person being depicted here. The term itself, just to do a little bit of review from my class here, is that of the forehead. It is the most, and the face, the most recognizable parts of our body. It is in our hands, it is in our feet, it is the face and the eyes and the mouth. It's where we vocalize. We're able to express our identities. And so there is at Tonina this one-to-one-ism in which the object becomes almost a kind of substitute. It becomes something that is imbued in an immanent theological way with the spirit of another person. Now, the third and final part of this talk this afternoon is going to deal again with this feature of scale and size, which wasn't an important part of Andrew Hamilton's study, but it will be part of mine as I write this up for the Mellon book. This has to do with the intent to force people to make things of a certain size or to wear them. And we would call this, in fact, the matter of the issue of the theme of sumptuary codes and also of how that then is expressed in representation. Now, we can turn to someone who was, of course, the father of the Elizabeth I, who is depicted in the Phoenix jewel we were looking at the beginning of this lecture. And there is our tyrannical, somewhat scary Henry VIII. He is a figure who is associated closely, particularly in the Tudor historiographical literature, with the attempt to devise sumptuary laws that would be applied to people within his kingdom. And he wasn't the only one. There's a big literature in this going back into the classical world. But think of it this way. It's the state of a centralized sort, particularly here of the Tudor variety, which had absolutist pretensions, attempting in 1509 to institute a series of what they called an act against wearing of costly apparel. Now, these kind of laws, as I said, continue throughout the European past. They're common in the Middle Ages, they're into the Renaissance and beyond. But they have to do with an anxiety, a preoccupation, a worry that people are dressing above their means and that you would not be able to instantly identify someone as to their social station if they're wearing costly apparel, silks or cloth of gold. And so there's an attempt here by the state to regulate what people look like. I think there are other anxieties going on here having to do with the growth of cities, have to do with the growth of a merchant class. It's becoming exceptionally endowed with rich purses. And this is a set of rules that ultimately fails utterly. They're constantly imposing new ones because, as is well known to many historians, these sumptuary laws are mostly aspirational. They're very difficult to enforce or to adjudicate. We know this in turn because the Aztecs, whom you will have heard about, did something very similar to this, particularly under the Emperor Moctezuma Iwicamina. He isn't the Moctezuma you've probably heard about, who was there when Cortes took over the Aztec Empire, but he is known to have been very concerned with appearances. Here he is presiding over an image that is being created at a place called Chapultepec. And he instituted a series of laws that were supposed to grade materials as to their intrinsic value, and then more to the point, determine who would be able to wear them. Now, this was complicated in the Aztec instance by the fact that the Aztec emperor was inviting obedience from some of his underlings by gifting them such costly apparel. And as has been pointed out by a number of scholars, including Patty Anawalt, these laws never seem to have any real legal purchase or tenacity. It's mostly interesting to us because it is a concern at the time. I believe the Maya were no different. If we look at this panel, which I actually helped to excavate many years ago at the site of Dos Pilas in Guatemala, you can see here a set of figures. This is, and if you'll forgive the very loose analogy, kind of like a bar mitzvah of a Maya prince, in that there is a figure on his knees who is about to circumcise, or probably to introduce the first bloodletting for this princeling. And then the proud parents over to the left-hand side, and there are two somewhat groveling, somewhat abject courtiers to the side. Now, what do we first see here in terms of what they're wearing? Well, the plain apparel is being worn by the two courtiers, one of whom is said to be the tutor of the prince, and by the queen. And then just to make it a little bit more complex, what we also see is a contrast between the quetzal, iridescent green plumes being worn by the king, and in this case, his wife is being allowed to wear such apparel, and the princeling himself, and then this figure in between who's kneeling and holding a small stingray spine in order to facilitate this first bloodletting, this first act of penance by an important prince who we never hear from again. He's wearing a paper headdress. They have jade and like as well. And I'm going to conclude here by looking at sumptuary scale and genre. That is, how size also played a large role in the dimensions of carvings. We're going to turn back to Tonina, which had a unique, I would say, focus on this theme of visual discourse among the Maya. And there we're looking at a small altar. It would have been flat on the surface, and it shows actually a posthumous depiction of an important personage at court. This is probably a princess of the royal house, an offspring of the monarch, but they're describing her death here, which I've highlighted for you in yellow, and then they've got her names in green, as in terms of a bald kind of expression, she died. They're not using the more elusive and detached, or you might say metaphoric expressions that would be particular to kings. There are other such altars that are mortuary, that show the deceased person. Probably offerings were made to their memory on these across Tonina. There is another one in which it is also referring to the death, in this case, of the firstborn child of a queen, probably, again, a person that did not come to the throne. And this ephemerality of life is something that we see playing out across Maya sculptures, the princelings that never come to high office. Let's look now, though, at a royal altar. Commissioned by a king. He does mention noblemen, and he mentions presiding gods, but the size is now vastly different from anything that would be seen systematically among the commemorative mortuary altars being made for the noblemen. So this is a dynastic preoccupation of Tonina, but they are not the only kingdom. I'll conclude here by bringing us back to a city that I know well and excavated for some years that I think illustrates beautifully this concept of regulated representation. And it is the kingdom of Piedras Negras, which had so many carvers, as we saw in my last lecture. Not a very large kingdom, but one that has an outsized role in archaeology because of the excavations that have been done there and because of the presence of many, many carvings that allow us a richly textured understanding of its dynastic history. You can also see it's a very broken ground. And what this meant, as has been studied by people such as Charles Golden and Andrew Scher, is that these kingdoms in this Appalachia of the Maya could only govern this broken territory by means of often proxies, noblemen who would be sent out to govern over smaller sites nearby. And this is what we see at Piedras Negras, although the patterns are a little bit different from kingdom to kingdom. There are two other cities here, La Mar and El Cayo, both of which, one of which I visited. It's a rather remote and rough part of this territory at this boundary zone between Guatemala and Mexico. But what we do have from this is a pattern of very similar kind of almost, I would say, sumptuary regulations as we can understand them as they are reified or materialized in the carvings. This is a royal stela from Piedras Negras. You see this from the meter or to the side. A stela from one of those smaller subsidiary sites at La Mar is tangibly smaller. And this would also apply to a variety of other sites. I looked at La Mar. Let's look at El Cayo. This is a gigantic stela that is now one of the highlights of the National Collection in Guatemala City. Again, from the meter scale, you can see it's much larger than anything at La Mar, and it is certainly much larger than a non-royal stela that has been attested and documented here in an early photograph from the 19th century at the city of El Cayo. In other words, the stelae here are similar in inverse way to what we saw as the relationship between Quirigua and Copan. There, the most important Maya city was dwarfed by the stelae being erected by this Johnny-come-lately over there at Quirigua. Here we see a very different pattern in which the peripheral, the provincial productions are ones that are much, much smaller than anything you would see at the metropole, at the center itself. And here you see an example of that close up. This has now been returned to Mexico, I'm happy to say. It used to be at the LA County Museum of Art. It is from La Mar as well, and it is also much, much smaller. Those are stelae. What about other carvings at Piedras Negras? In order to convince you, should I have any difficulty in doing so, that there really are these regulatory distinctions between the center and the periphery. Now, these are royal panels, including one that I excavated. It's in the upper right-hand side of this diagram. These are all mortuary. They're placed directly atop of the pyramids where royalty happened to be interred. And they are panels that show important moments in their life. It's almost as though they're vignetting some happy, felicitous occasion, which that king was particularly proud of. There also are some queens. The one in the lower middle is, in fact, the mortuary panel placed on a pyramid associated with the burial of a queen. Let's do that same comparison that we just embarked on with the stelae. This is the panel that I dug up back in 2000. Fairly large. It had to be removed from the site to be taken to the National Museum by a Chinook helicopter, of all things. That was an adventurous voyage. And then you can see to the side, and I will now fall through a rapid segue of images of non-royal panels. There's this one, which is at Lacma, 687. These are all from smaller sites that are subservient to Piedras Negras. This is the Dumbarton Oaks panel, not too far from here. It's a little bit later in date, and then somewhat later in date, the New Orleans panel. Many of these are in provenance, as you can make out, because they're small, they come from provincial unguarded sites, and they're potentially easy to carry off, as some were. And then here's the Cleveland panel, which is showing a queen. Notice again the discrepancy in size and in scale between all of these. Both size and scale are being invoked here and reworked. They're operating on you as someone that might be looking at these objects. Now, as I conclude here on a final cultural observation, you might ask, how is this possibly regulated? How is it possibly enforced? These pieces are made out of limestone. It's a material that you can find anywhere in the Maya area. It's not as though they're made of jade or some other precious substance. The way in which this is probably regulated was not by means of adjudicative law or by royal fiat. It was done through through the person of the carvers. Now, this is the Cleveland panel, probably from the site of El Cayo, and it's carved down to some extent. But you can see there highlighted in red a figure that I introduced in my last lecture. That is nothing more and nothing less than the name of the carver of this panel. And there's another one as well over to the side. We know this carver because this person is attested in the monumental record, in the inscriptions of Pietas Negras, as being very active at the city himself. Here is an instance that comes from the final ruler of the site. It's dating to November 3rd, 785. So this same carver is active, apparently, in producing monuments, both at a peripheral location and also at the metropole itself, where the dynasty itself resides. And then we also know that he is becoming active. He is active for some time to come. As late as 795 at Pietas Negras, he is still creating monuments. What this suggests to us is the means of control is through the restriction of knowledge. That is, the people who are able to carve these with aplomb are very few in number. They're named in this area, and they themselves probably lived at Pietas Negras. Now, these are fairly substantial monuments. You saw the panel that I excavated at Pietas Negras. That weighed many, many, many pounds. The fact of the matter is those smaller panels are in themselves relatively lightweight. This is what makes them eminently lootable when shaved down somewhat. And so what we see here are probably carvings that were made at Pietas Negras under the close supervision of carvers who were themselves subservient to close royal will. And the objects themselves are then being transported out as a kind of favor to these local provincial lords who are being given, in a sense, access to memories perpetually engraved in stone that would ordinarily only be available to kings. This is rife with anxiety, as all such sumptuary regulations are, but somehow at Tonina and Pietas Negras and at other locations, kings found a way. Now, to conclude, what we've looked at here are three different variables that have been studied by Hamilton: the reductions, the enlargements, the commensurations. But what I want to end on here, my final two images, is the fact that these are always local stories. They're local trajectories. They involve local personalities that we wish to exhume from the records that have left for us in the graphosphere of the Maya of the time. And that local is nonetheless always infused with broader understandings of what is sacred and what is holy, what is controllable, and ultimately what is not. And I would say that we see here, as played out in this lecture during this, rather rainy Sunday afternoon in Washington, D.C., is the physical grounding of difference, of social hierarchy that is materialized in the form of these limestone carvings and the small pieces of jade which were left to us by the Maya. By these means, things that are inherently ephemeral and difficult to pin down, like the social differences that all of us perceive to exist in societies past and present, are somehow made permanent through this material expression. Thank you.